Section 21 of A Dozen Ways of Love by Lily Dougall. A Freak of Cupid, Chapter 5. Courthope had struck across the main road at right angles to the poplar avenue. The poplars stood slim, upright, more like a stiff and regular formation of feathery seaweed growing out of a frozen ocean than like trees upon a plain. He was nearing a grove of elm and birch, which he had not seen the evening before. By the almost hidden rails of the fence there were half-buried shrubs. So dry, so hard, so absolutely without bud or sere leaf was the interlacing outline of the trees and shrubs that they too seemed to be some strange product of this new sort of ocean. They did not remind him of verdant glades. Not that beauty was absent, nor charm, but the scene was strange, very strange. The domain of the laughing princess, on whom he had turned his back, was, in the daylight, more than ever an enchanted land which he could fancy to be unknown in story and until now unexplored by man. Such ideas only came to him by snatches. The rest of him, mind and body, was summed up in the fierce determination to catch the thief and bring back his spoils. Whether by this he would prove himself honest or guilty, he neither knew nor felt that he cared. Gradually, as he thought less about his snowshoes, he found that the wide lateral swing which he had been giving to his leg was unneeded. Strange as it seemed, the large rackets did not interfere when he took an ordinary step. Having made this pleasant discovery, he quickened speed. He did not know whether the girl had stopped laughing and had gone into the house again, but he knew that the falling snow and the branches of the trees must now hinder her from seeing him distinctly. In a moment he was glad of this, for, becoming incautious, he fell. Both arms, put out to save himself, were embedded to the very shoulder straight down in snow that offered no bottom to his touch. When his next impulse was to move knees and feet, he found that the points of his snowshoes were dug deep, and his toes, tied to them, held the soles of his feet in the same position. What cursed temerity had made him confess to a criminal act in order to allow him to come on this fool's errand? Fool, indeed, had he been to suppose that he could walk upon a frozen cloud without falling through. Such were Courthope's reflections. By degrees he got himself up, but only by curling himself round and taking off his snowshoes. By degrees he got the snowshoes put on again, and mounted out of the hole which he had made, with snow adhering to all his garments, and snow melting adown his neck and wrists. He now realized that he had spent nearly half an hour in walking not a quarter of a mile. With this cheerless reflection as a companion he went doggedly on, choosing now the drifted main road for a path. Having left behind him the skeleton form of the trees, he trudged across an open plain, flat almost as the surface of the lake which he had traversed yesterday. Sometimes the fences at the side of the roads were wholly hidden. More often they showed the top of their posts or upper bar. Sometimes he could see cross fences, as if outlining fields, so that he supposed he still walked through lands farmed from the lonely stone house, that he was still upon his lady's domain. He meditated upon her, judging that she was sweet beyond compare, although why he thought so, after her mistrust and derision, was one of those secrets which the dimpled Cupid only could explain. He was forced to acknowledge the fact that thus he did think, because here he was walking, whither he hardly knew, battling with the gale, hustled roughly by its white wings, in danger at every turn of falling off the two small moving rafts of his shoes into a sea in which no man could swim very long. He wondered, should his snowshoes break, if he would be able to flounder to the rim of the fence? How long could he sit there? Certainly it would seem, looking north and south and east and west, that he would need to sit as long as the life in him might endure the frost. At length, a shed or a small barn met his eye. His own approach seemed to have been heard and answered from within. The neigh of a horse greeted him. At first he supposed that some horses belonging to the house were stabled here, and neglected because the roads were impassable. Then he judged that so slight a shed could not be intended for a stable. He answered the animal's cry by seeking the door. Against it the drift was not deep, for, as it opened on the sheltered side, he had only the snowfall to scrape away. The door, which had very recently been freed from its crust of frost, yielded easily. He found a brown shaggy horse tied within, and beside it a sleigh, such as he had frequently seen, a mere platform of wood upon runners. Otherwise the shed was empty. Courthope was quickly struck by the recognition of something which set his memory working. The old buffalo skin on the sleigh was such as was common, but the way it was stretched upon a heap of sacks made him remember the sleigh that he had yesterday passed upon the river, and the keen, sinister face of the driver, which had ill contrasted with his apparent sleep and stupidity. Courthope tossed aside the skin with a jerk. A rum bottle, a small hoard of frozen bread and bacon, a heavy blanket folded beneath, all seemed to prove that the driver had made provision for a longer journey. The horse had no food before it, no blanket was upon its back. Probably its driver had not intended to leave it here so long. Where was the driver? This quickly became in Courthope's mind the all-important question. Why had he been skulking on the most lonely part of the lake? And now, recalling again the man's face, he believed that he had had an evil design. Courthope pursued his way, for, whether the thief had gone farther or remained in its vicinity, it was evidently desirable to have help from the nearest neighbors to seek and capture him. Courthope soon reached what seemed to be a dip or hollow in the plain. In this the wind had been very busy leveling the surface with the higher ground. At first he supposed that, for some reason, the road and fences had come to an abrupt ending. Then he discovered that he merely walked higher above the natural level. The thought came to him that if he should here break his snowshoes, there would not be even the neighboring fence-top on which to perch and freeze. Suddenly all his attention was concentrated on a dark something, like a bit of cloth fallen in the snow. As he came close and touched the cloth, he found it to be the covering of a basket almost buried. Pushing away the snow-crusted covering and feeling with eager fingers among the icy contents, he quickly knew that this was no other than the stolen silver of which he was in quest. A thrill of gratitude to fortune for so kindly a freak had hardly passed through his mind before his eye sought a depression in the snow just beyond. He saw now that a man was lying there. The head resting upon an arm was but slightly covered with snow. The whole form had sunk by its own heat into a cavity like a grave. Courthope lifted the head. The face was that of the man whom he had seen yesterday upon the river. The arms, when he raised them, fell again to the snow like lead. Yet he perceived that life was not extinct. Even in the frost the odor of rum was to be perceived, and breath, although so feeble as to be unseen, still passed in and out of the tightly drawn nostrils. The touch, that would have been reverent to a corpse, was now rough. He shook the fallen man and shouted. He raised him to a sitting posture, but finding that, standing as he did upon soft snow, to lift him was impossible, he laid him again in the self-made grave. That posture, at least, would be the most conducive to the continued motion of the heart. Standing upon the other side of the body, Courthope's shoe struck upon another hard object, which he found to be a case, stolen locked as it was, which contained, no doubt, the other valuables whose loss Madge had first discovered. The wretch, weighted by a burden in each hand, had apparently missed his way when endeavoring to return to the shed in which he had left his horse, and wandering in circles, perhaps for hours, had evidently succumbed to drink and cold, caught as in a trap by the unusual violence of the storm. There was nothing to be done but to return to the house for Moran's aid, and, lifting the handles of basket and case in either hand, Courthope doubled back upon his own track, thankful that he had already attained to some skill in snowshoeing. As he neared the house, his heart beat high at the excitement of seeing Madge's delight. He closely scanned the windows, even the tiny windows in the pointed tin roof, but no eager eyes were on the lookout. Loudly he thumped upon the heavy front door. There was somewhat of a bustle inside at the knock. The snow-bound household collected quickly at the welcome thought of a message from the outside world. When the door was opened, Madge and the Morans, were there to behold Courthope carrying the plunder, he perceived at once that his guilt, if not doubted before, was now proved beyond all doubt. There was a distinct measure of reserve in the satisfaction they expressed. Madge especially was very grave, with a strong flavour of moral severity in her words and demeanour. Courthope explained to her that the other man was dying in the snow, that if his life was to be saved no time must be lost. She repeated the story in French to Morin, and thereupon arose high words from the Frenchman. Madge looked doubtfully at Courthope, and then she interpreted. It seemed that the Frenchman's desire was to put him out again and lock up the house, leaving the two accomplices to shift for themselves as best they might. Courthope urged motives of humanity. He described the man and his condition. At length he prevailed. Madge insisted that if Morin did not go, she would. In a few moments both she and Morin were preparing to set out. It seemed useless for Courthope to precede them. He went into the dining room, demanding food of Madame Morin. He found that Elize had been carried down and placed in her chair in the midst of domestic activities. As soon as she spied him, being in a nervous, hysterical state, she opened her mouth and shrieked sharply. The shriek at this time had more the tone of a child's anger than of a woman's fear. With a strong sense of humour he sat down at the table, and she, realizing that he was not imminently dangerous, railed upon him. "Viper in the bosom," said Elize. Courthope, almost famished, ate fast. "Daughter of the horse-leech crying, 'Give,' and sucking blood from the hand it gives," she continued. "Sir Charles Grandison would never have kicked a man when he was down," he said. "He would have tried to do good even to the viper he had nourished." The memory of Sir Charles's well-known method, even with the most villainous, appeared to distract her attention for a moment. "And then they all sent for him and confessed and made amends, just as I have done," Courthope went on. But the fact that a laugh was gleaming in his eyes enraged the little cripple. "How dare you talk to me, sitting there pretending to be a gentleman?" "I would rather be allowed to make a better toilet if my reputation were to rest upon a pretence. I never heard of a gentlemanly villain who went about without collar and cuffs, and had not been allowed access to his hairbrush." "A striped jacket and a shaved head is generally what he goes about in after he's unmasked. If I had been Madge, I would not have let you off." "Come, remember how sorry Elizabeth Bennet was when she found she had given way to prejudice. If I remember right, she lay awake many nights." "Are you adding insult to injury by insinuating that either of us might bestow upon you—" "Oh, certainly not. I merely wish to suggest that a young lady possessing lively talents and remarkably fine eyes might yet make great mistakes in her estimate of the masculine character." The cripple, who perhaps had never before heard her one beautiful feature praised by masculine lips, was obliged to harden herself. "Accomplished wretch!" she cried, in accents worthy of an irate Pamela. "Do you suppose it was the last time I was serving my term in jail that I read our favourite novels?" he asked. By this time Morin had passed out of the door to put on his snowshoes, and Courthope, who had swallowed only as much food as was necessary to keep him from starvation, turned out to repeat the process of putting on his, this time more deftly. Morin had a toboggan upon which were piled such necessaries as Madge had collected. They began their march 3 abreast into the storm. They went a long way without conversation, and yet Courthope found in this march keen enjoyment. His heart was absurdly light. To have performed so considerable a service for Madge, now to be walking beside her on an errand of mercy, was as much joy as the present hour could hold. It was difficult for him to keep up with the others, yet in doing so there was the pleasure of the athlete in having acquired a new mastery over his muscles, and the fascination of being at home in the snow as a seabird is at home in the surf, which is the chief element of delight in all winter sports, was his for the first time. With the drunken wretch, who was almost frozen, he felt small sympathy. But he had the sense that all modern men have on such occasions, that he ought to be concerned, which kept him grave. The other two were not light-hearted. Morin, dragging the toboggan behind him and walking with his grey head bent forward to the gale, was sullen at being driven in the service of thieves. Afraid lest some sinister design was still intended, he cast constant glances of cunning suspicion at Courthope. As for Madge, she appeared grave and preoccupied beyond all that was natural to her, suffering, he feared, from the pain of her first disillusionment. This was a suffering that he was hardly in a position to take seriously, and yet his heart yearned over her. He thought also that she was pondering over the problem of her next responsibility, and the evidence of this came sooner than he had expected. When they got to the place where his first track diverged straight to the shed, she and Morin stopped to exchange remarks. They evidently perceived in this the clearest evidence of all against him. Had he not gone straight to the place where the accomplice had agreed to wait? Then Madge fell back a little to where he was now plodding in the rear. She accosted him in the soft tones that had from the first so charmed him, contrasting with her sister's voice as the tones of a reed pipe contrast with those from metal, or as the full voice of the cuckoo with the shrill chirp of the sparrow. The soft voice was very serious, the manner more than sedate, the words studied. "I am afraid that nothing that I can say will persuade you to alter a way of life which you seem to have chosen, but it seems to me very sad that one of your ability should so degrade himself." She stopped with a little gasp for breath, as if frightened at her own audacity. Her manner and phrases were an evident imitation of the way in which she had heard advice bestowed upon vagrant or criminal by the benevolent judge whose memory she so tenderly cherished. It was second nature to her to act as she fancied he would have acted. Courthope composed himself to receive the judicial admonition with becoming humility. His whole sympathy was with her. His mind was aglow with the quaint humour of it. "You must know," rebuked Madge, "how very wrong it is, and it is not possible that you could have difficulty in getting some honest employment." "It is very kind of you to interest yourself in me." He kept his eyes upon the ground. "I do not know, of course, what led you to begin a life of crime, or in what way you found out what houses in this country were worth robbing, but I fear you must have led a wicked life for a long time." She was very severe now. "You are young yet. Why should you carry on your nefarious schemes in a new country, where, if you would, you could easily reform?" Again a little gasp for breath. "I have promised to let you go without giving you into the hands of the law. I am afraid I did a selfish and weak thing, because others may suffer from your crimes, and I wish you could take this opportunity which my leniency gives you, and try to reform before you have lost your reputation as well as your character." "It is very kind of you," he murmured again, and still as he walked he looked upon his feet. He had no thought now of again denying his guilt. Having denied and, as she thought, confessed, he felt that to change once more would only evoke her greater scorn. "Let be," his heart said. "Let come what will. I will not confuse her further today." End of chapter 5.